look at the device you are listening to this on right now. Like, really look at it. Notice the casing, the screen, the way it rests in your hand or on your desk.
Yeah, it's a marvel of modern engineering, right?
Exactly. Now look at the walls of the room you are in, the floor beneath your feet. Classical physics, the hard science that allowed engineers to build that device, can tell us with astonishing precision exactly how those atoms interact.
Oh, yeah, the math is incredibly robust. I mean, we know the exact electromagnetic forces transmitting this audio to your ears right now.
Right. We know the exact gravitational curvature holding you to the floor. But, and this is a big, but classical physics is completely entirely silent on why any of this exists in the first place.
It maps the paint on the canvas, but it ignores the canvas itself.
It analyzes the brushstrokes, yeah, but it cannot tell us a single thing about what the canvas actually is. Which brings us to our mission for this deep dive.
It's the blind spot of modern science, honestly.
It really is. We've spent, what, the last 400 years charting the territory of reality?
At least.
Yeah.
But we stubbornly avoid asking how the ground we are standing on materialized out of the void.
So today, we are going after the canvas. We are going to trace the most fundamental journey possible.
A journey from absolute, pure nothingness.
Yes, all the way to the stable physical matter that makes up your body. And we are doing this through the lens of a highly provocative conceptual framework from our sources today.
Right, the Nix Krusta Etwas theory, or the NKE.
Which translates to the nothing crust something theory in English. And before we get into it, let's establish some ground rules for this deep dive.
Good idea. The main rule being no complex mathematical formulas today.
Thank goodness. Yeah, we aren't getting bogged down in pages of calculus or Greek symbols. We're looking strictly at the logical architecture of existence.
And we should clarify early on that nothingness in this context isn't just empty space.
Because empty space is still something, right?
Exactly. Empty space has dimensions. It has virtual particles popping in and out of existence. The NKE requires us to conceptualize an absolute zero state.
So no dimensions, no physical laws, no time, pure absence.
Pure absence. And that's why the NKE isn't categorized as a standard physical theory. It's an ontological theory.
Let's break that down for a second. What's the fundamental difference between physics and ontology here?
Well, physics, especially since the early 20th century, is fundamentally epistemological and mathematical. It's concerned with what we can measure.
And how we can predict future measurements, right?
Exactly. But an ontological theory deals with the nature of being itself. It doesn't just ask about the mathematical rules of an electron.
It asks what actually causes the electron to exist rather than not exist.
Yes. The author of the NKE argues that mainstream physics has stalled because it keeps trying to answer ontological questions using mathematical tools from inside the system.
I mean, if we are trapped inside the universe, we can't exactly step outside of it to put it on a scale, you know?
We are a product of the system trying to observe the system, which leads us directly into the territory of Kurt Gödel.
Ah, Gödel's incompleteness theorems from the 1930s, right?
Yeah, and they sent absolute shockwaves through mathematics. He proved rigorously that in any sufficiently complex logical system, there will always be true statements that cannot be proven using the rules of that system itself.
So you cannot use a system to prove its own foundational axioms.
Exactly.
Give me a tangible example of how that applies to our understanding of the universe.
Okay. Imagine you are a character inside a highly advanced, perfectly simulated video game.
Like The Sims or something more complex.
Sure, like an incredibly realistic Sims. You can use the game's internal physics engine to prove that if you drop an apple, it falls at a specific rate.
Oy, I'm following.
You can prove the existence of all the digital matter around you. But you can never, using only the tools within the game, prove that a programmer sitting in an office in California wrote the code.
Oh, wow. Because the proof of the system's origin lies outside the system's verifiable parameters.
Exactly. You literally don't have the tools to prove it.
So if traditional mathematical proof is literally impossible for a theory of everything because of this Gödelian trap, how does the NKE justify its claims? Are we just, like, abandoning proof altogether?
We abandon internal mathematical proof, yeah. But we rely on something the theory calls TA.
Capital T, small a, capital W. What does that stand for?
Temporary absolute Wahrheit, or temporary absolute truth. It is essentially the highest form of circumstantial coherence.
Circumstantial coherence. Okay, let's unpack that. Like a court case.
Exactly like a court case. If you don't have a video of a suspect committing a crime, you build a web of circumstantial evidence.
Right. Motive, opportunity, forensics.
Yeah. And if 1,000 independent pieces of evidence all point to one specific sequence of events, and there are absolutely no logical contradictions.
The jury accepts it as the truth.
Precisely. In science, a concept becomes a taw when it provides a perfectly coherent explanation for all observed phenomena without requiring external miracles.
And it remains the absolute truth temporarily until a single new observation breaks the web.
Which is how science works anyway.
Yeah.
Newton's theory of gravity was a temporary absolute truth for centuries.
Right. It worked perfectly for everything we observed until our telescopes got better and we saw anomalies in Mercury's orbit that Newton couldn't explain.
And then Einstein came along and gave us a new taw with general relativity.
A great historical parallel. So the NKE argues that our current standard models, like quantum mechanics and relativity, have reached the limits of their taw status.
Because they cannot explain their own ingredients.
Let's focus on those ingredients for a bit. Classical physics relies heavily on a pre-existing map, doesn't it?
Oh, totally. All of modern physics operates like a highly sophisticated recipe. The standard model can tell you exactly what happens when you smash two protons together.
Right, in a particle accelerator at nearly the speed of light.
Yeah, it calculates the decay rates, the energy release, the scattering angles, all of it. But the recipe fundamentally requires the protons to exist beforehand.
Right, it needs the ingredients. It requires the vacuum of space to exist as a stage for the collision.
And it requires the dimension of time to allow the event to unfold.
It's like, okay, if I want to bake a loaf of bread, the laws of chemistry dictate exactly how the yeast will react with the sugars in the flour.
And how the heat of the oven will expand the gas.
Exactly. Chemistry explains the baking flawlessly, but chemistry doesn't explain where the wheat grew or how the water was formed or who built the oven.
And that is the exact boundary the NKE is trying to cross. If you claim to have a theory of everything, you cannot start with a fundamental law of quantum gravity.
Or a multidimensional string from string theory.
Right, because if you start with a string, your immediate philosophical requirement is to explain the material of the string.
And the space the string vibrates within, you are just pushing the mystery back one layer.
The NKE insists that the only valid starting point for reality is a complete, absolute lack of properties.
Zero flour, zero water, zero oven, absolute nothingness.
The pure void.
But wait, I have to push back here. If you have absolutely zero materials, no energy, no laws of physics governing behavior, how do you cross the threshold into something?
It's a conceptual leap, for sure.
Because a void doesn't just magically decide to manifest an electron. You can't get something out of nothing without a creator, which you just said we can't rely on.
Because a creator just adds an unexplained variable outside the system, yes. But the mechanism isn't about conjuring substance out of the void.
It's not magically summoning matter.
No. The foundational premise is that the universe is built entirely on the concept of creating a difference within the nothingness.
A difference within nothingness. How do you differentiate a void from a void?
By establishing a boundary. And to understand the mechanics of this boundary, we have to look at the central engine of the entire theory.
Okay, let's get into the engine, the Busfo process.
Yes, the Busfo process.
Busfo is an acronym drawn from German. Let's break down the mechanics of what this engine actually does.
It stands for binär, unendlich schnell, fein, and omnipresent.
Binary, infinitely fast, infinitely fine, and omnipresent.
Exactly. This process is the physical realization of the nothing crust of something tautology.
So we start with the pure nothingness, the nichts.
Out of this pure state, a virtual separation occurs. A boundary is drawn. That boundary is the crust,
Okay.
The moment you introduce a boundary, even an infinitely thin, entirely virtual boundary that merely separates nothing from nothing, you've created a dual state.
You have side A and side B.
It's the ultimate cosmic bit of information, a fundamental 0 and a 1, which satisfies the B in Busfo binär. It is a binary split.
Right. Now, because this split is occurring in a state of absolute nothingness, there's no mass, right?
No mass, no viscosity. There are absolutely no physical forces resisting the separation.
So because there is absolute zero resistance, the action of this separation occurs unendlich schnell. Infinitely fast.
Yes. Speed is only limited by the friction or mass of an environment. In a true void, action is instantaneous.
Okay, so that's the U and the S. What about the fineness?
Furthermore, because there is no physical material being cut or divided, the boundary itself has no physical depth. It is unendlich fein, infinitely fine.
And the final one, omnipresent?
Well, because there is no pre-existing concept of localized space, no coordinates where this event is happening versus not happening, this virtual separation is an omnipresent condition,
It occurs everywhere simultaneously.
everywhere all at once. So we have an omnipresent, infinitely fast, infinitely thin binary split of absolute nothingness.
And that split creates the etwas, the something.
But we must be really careful with the word something here. It is not a solid object, it is an action.
So the universe isn't a collection of things.
No, in this framework, it is a continuous eternal algorithm. The Busfo process didn't just happen once, 13.8 billion years ago.
It's not just the Big Bang.
It is the underlying hum of existence. It's happening inside the atoms of your body right now, sustaining the illusion of solidity.
I'm trying to visualize this continuous process. It kind of reminds me of the refresh rate on a computer monitor.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Like, you look at a screen and you see a solid, stable picture of a landscape. But we know it's not a static image.
Right, the pixels are refreshing 60, maybe 120 times a second.
The reality of the image is sustained by a hyper-fast underlying cycle. If you unplug the monitor, the cycle stops, the image vanishes. The Busfo process is like the cosmic refresh rate.
That captures the continuous nature of the process beautifully, but we need to refine it slightly.
How so?
A computer monitor has physical pixels and electrical currents that exist prior to the image.
Right, the hardware is already there.
But the Busfo process is more profound. It is the refresh rate generating the pixels of reality out of a blank void over and over, infinitely fast.
Okay, but if this process is just an infinitely fast separation of nothing from nothing, why doesn't it just immediately recombine?
What do you mean?
Like, if I swing a sword through a pool of water, the water parts. But the moment the blade passes, the water rushes back together seamlessly.
Ah, I see.
If you separate a true void, shouldn't the two virtual halves instantly snap back together, perfectly canceling each other out, leaving us with exactly zero again?
Your logic is flawless. It hits on the exact mathematical reality of a perfect system.
So it should cancel out.
If the Busfo process were flawless, the virtual separation would result in a wave and an anti-wave that recombine perfectly. They would return to absolute zero.
Meaning there would be no structure, no reality.
Exactly. But I am looking at you right now. The system clearly isn't returning to absolute zero.
Because the system is inherently mathematically incapable of perfection.
Yes. The NKE theory introduces lemma 3, which dictates that a symmetry break is unavoidable.
Unavoidable. Why can't the void just be perfect?
Because you are dealing with three infinities simultaneously. Infinite speed, infinite fineness, and omnipresence.
And infinities are messy.
In mathematical logic, when multiple infinities intersect, absolute precision breaks down. You cannot have a flawless synchronization of infinite variables.
So a tiny structural imperfection, a symmetry break, must occur during the separation and recombination cycle.
The cosmic refresh rate stutters.
It stutters. Okay, what happens when it stutters?
When the virtual crust separates the nothingness into a positive and a negative state, they attempt to snap back together to annihilate one another. But due to the mandatory symmetry break, they don't perfectly align.
They miss each other.
They miss each other by an infinitesimally small fraction of a degree.
And because they fail to perfectly cancel out, a microscopic residue of the process is left behind, right?
Yes, a leftover vibration in the void.
Yeah.
The NKE calls these verwaist resonance and orphaned resonances.
Orphaned resonances. I think of active noise-canceling headphones here.
Oh, how so?
Well, the headphones sample the ambient noise around you and generate an exact anti-noise frequency. When the noise and anti-noise collide perfectly, they annihilate, and you hear silence.
If the system is perfect, the result is zero sound.
But if the anti-noise is off by even a microsecond, or the waveform is slightly deformed, you don't get silence. You hear a faint, persistent static.
Yes.
So you're saying that the entirety of the observable universe, every galaxy, every biological cell, is quite literally just the accumulated static of a failed cosmic noise cancellation system.
That is a staggering but entirely accurate way to view the fundamental reality proposed by the NKE.
That is wild.
The universe operates on borrowed energy. The total net value of the universe is still zero. For every positive, there is a negative. But the imperfect cancellation means we exist in the chaotic, vibrating static left in the wake of the process.
This glitch, this tiny failure to cancel out, does something else too, doesn't it? Before the first orphaned resonance, there was no way to measure progression.
Exactly. The symmetry break is the physical birthplace of time.
Walk me through the mechanics of that, because we usually think of time as a dimension that already exists, like a track that events run along.
That is the Newtonian view, absolute time ticking away in the background, regardless of what happens. But let's look at the void before the glitch.
Okay, pure nothingness.
You have an infinitely fast process of separating nothing and perfectly recombining it. State A is absolute zero. State B is absolute zero. State C is absolute zero.
There is absolutely no distinguishing feature between any of these states.
None. And without difference, progression is a meaningless concept. If you took a snapshot, you couldn't tell if it was the past, the present, or the future.
Because they are structurally identical. It's just an eternal, static loop.
But the very first moment an orphaned resonance is left behind, the moment the static appears, the landscape of reality fundamentally changes.
You now have a marker.
You could definitively point to a state before the static existed and a state after the static existed.
The environment went from a pure zero to a 0.0001. The difference is permanent.
Yes. In the NKE, time is not a dimensional track. Time is purely an emergent property. It is the continuous measurement of persistent difference.
So the accumulation of orphaned resonances provides the forward arrow of time.
Without the symmetry break, there is no difference. Without difference, there is no time.
So the stutter in the algorithm gives us time, and it gives us this cosmic static, these orphaned resonances. But static is inherently chaotic.
Very chaotic.
Like, if I tune an old radio between stations, I just get a roar of white noise. I don't get a Beethoven symphony. How does random leftover vibration in a void eventually structure itself into the highly specific laws of chemistry?
To understand the transition from chaos to structure, we have to look at the macro environment created by the continuous busfo process.
The environment the static lives in.
Right. It generates what the theory calls the Busco-Geflecht, the busfo lattice.
The lattice.
Because the separation process is omnipresent and infinitely fast, it creates an infinitely expanding three-dimensional vibrating web of virtual boundaries.
A structural matrix expanding outward.
And within this matrix, you have an unimaginable number of these orphaned resonances bouncing around, interfering with each other, colliding, amplifying, and destroying one another.
Pure chaos.
The original source text refers to this state of pure, unstructured vibrational chaos as Rosarauschen, or pink noise.
Pink noise. Okay, but how do we get stable matter out of pink noise?
Okay. The author utilizes a conceptual application of Falting's theorem.
Gerd Faltings, the mathematician.
Yeah, he won the Fields Medal for proving the Mordell conjecture. We won't touch the math, but the conceptual core is profound. He proved that within certain infinite mathematical spaces, under specific geometrical conditions, there were only a strictly finite number of rational solutions.
What does that mean for our cosmic static?
It means that an infinite sea of chaotic vibrations cannot sustain itself randomly forever. The geometric properties of the expanding busfo lattice act as a filter.
A filter for the noise.
Out of the infinite possibilities of chaotic frequencies, the vast majority are highly unstable. When they collide, they annihilate each other or scatter back into weak static.
But mathematically?
Mathematically, a very specific, finite number of complex frequency combinations will happen to perfectly harmonize with the geometry of the lattice.
So the chaos naturally filters itself into stability.
Yes. These stable frequency combinations don't destroy each other. They lock into self-sustaining loops.
They are the finite rational solutions to the infinite chaos.
Exactly. The NKE calls these stable loops resonance cocktails.
Resonance cocktails. It's like, okay, imagine having 10,000 monkeys locked in a room, violently smashing the keys of 10,000 pianos.
That would be deafening.
It's a wall of deafening, chaotic noise. But the room itself has incredibly rigid, specific acoustics. The shape of the walls dictates that any sound wave that isn't part of a perfect C major chord is instantly reflected back and phase canceled.
Well, like this.
No matter how wildly the monkeys play, the only sound that can actually survive and propagate in that room is the C major chord.
The analogy works if you remove the monkeys and the pianos.
Right, because there's no outside force hitting the keys.
The chaos isn't being generated by an external agent. The vibrations are the environment. They are fighting for survival within their own medium.
And the lattice automatically, ruthlessly phase cancels the discordant noise,
leaving only the harmonious C major chords. And these stable chords, these resonance cocktails, are what we perceive as fundamental matter.
So an electron or a quark or a hydrogen atom, they aren't physical objects. They aren't tiny billiard balls of solid stuff.
None at all. In the NKE, the concept of a solid particle is a total illusion. An atom is simply an incredibly stable, highly complex resonance cocktail vibrating on the busfo lattice.
It is the persistent knot of frequencies.
Yes, a persistent knot.
And what about space? You mentioned the lattice is three-dimensional, but if the universe started as nothing, where does the physical dimension of space actually come from?
That's the logical next question.
Is it just the empty box that these resonance cocktails vibrate inside?
Classical physics treats space like an empty stage where actors, the particles, perform. NKE discards the stage entirely.
So space isn't a pre-existing container.
Space is an emergent property. Once you have these stable resonance cocktails, they begin to interact based on their frequencies. They harmonize, they repel, they lock into specific geometrical alignments with one another.
Because certain frequencies naturally enforce a specific distance between them to maintain harmony.
Precisely. The geometric relationship, the stable distance maintained between these vibrating nodes, is space.
Space is the relationship.
Yes, space doesn't exist independently of the matter. If you remove all the resonance cocktails, you don't have an empty room left over. You have a collapse back into dimensionless nothingness.
Because space is just the architecture of the relationships between the vibrations.
Exactly.
That is a severe paradigm shift. Matter is just stable vibration, and space is the relationship between those vibrations. But this opens up a massive problem for me.
Let's hear it.
If there are no solid particles, and space is just a relationship, how do things interact physically? How do the fundamental forces work?
Ah, the forces.
Yeah. Classical physics tells us that gravity is a force pulling objects together, and electromagnetism is a force between charged particles.
Well, if you throw away the particles, you must also throw away the classical idea of fundamental forces reaching across an empty void to pull on things.
So no invisible rubber bands?
No rubber bands.
Mm.
Forces are not independent entities in the NKE. They are emergent mechanical behaviors of the resonances wrestling on the lattice.
Let's start with gravity. That's the most intuitive force. I drop an apple, it falls to the ground.
Newton said mass attracts mass. Einstein said mass warps the fabric of space-time.
Right. How does the NKE explain gravity without mass or space-time?
The theory redefined gravitation as the Mitzi effect, which translates to the drag effect.
The drag effect. Okay, how does that work?
To understand the mechanism, we must remember that the busful lattice is not a static grid.
Because the busful process is an omnipresent, infinitely fast algorithm continuously separating the void.
Exactly. So the lattice itself is radically, constantly expanding radially at the speed of light. It is a dynamic, outward-pushing matrix.
The fabric is constantly rushing outward.
Now place a highly complex stable resonance cocktail onto this expanding lattice, say, the billions of stable frequencies that make up a star.
Okay, so a very dense structure.
Because this resonance is incredibly structurally dense and complex, it doesn't just passively ride the lattice. It deforms it. It creates structural resistance.
It's a massive knot in the weave.
Yes. And as the surrounding lattice attempts to continue expanding outward at the speed of light, this complex knot resists. It creates friction against the expansion.
And this dynamic friction is the Mitzi effect.
The drag created by the knot against the expanding web distorts the local geometry of the lattice.
So if there are two knots relatively close to each other,
The expansion of the lattice is hindered between them by their mutual drag. The localized distortion causes the geometry between the two knots to effectively contract relative to the surrounding expansion.
so they drift toward each other.
They do.
It's like having two heavy knots in a giant, tightly woven fishing net. The net is being vigorously stretched outward from all sides.
I can picture that.
But because the knots are heavy and tangled, they resist the stretching. The tension of the net pulling outward against the resistance of the knots causes the fabric between the knots to warp.
And they naturally slide down that warp toward one another.
Exactly.
You are capturing the effect perfectly, though we must remember there is no external net being pulled by an outside force.
Right, it's internal.
The geometry of their resistance to the internal expansion creates an apparent vector of attraction.
Yeah.
What you feel holding you to the floor right now isn't a mysterious magnetic-like pull from the Earth's core.
It's just structural drag.
It is the structural drag of the complex resonance cocktails of your body, combining with the immense drag of the Earth's resonance, resisting the light speed expansion of the universe. Gravity is not a pull. It is an aggregation caused by structural drag.
That entirely rewrites how I feel sitting in this chair right now.
Okay, what about electromagnetism? If it's not positive and negative particles exchanging photons, what is a magnetic field?
Remember that these resonance cocktails are highly complex, three-dimensional vibrations. They have directionality, they spin.
Okay, they spin.
Electromagnetism in the NKE is simply the physical interference pattern of these spinning wave structures on the lattice.
Interference patterns,
Yeah.
like waves on a pond intersecting.
Exactly. If you have two resonances with compatible harmonic spin directions, their wave patterns mesh smoothly, they slip into each other's grooves,
Which reduces local resistance.
and the drag effect pulls them together. We observe this and label it attraction.
And if the spins are incompatible?
If they spin in conflicting directions, their wave patterns clash violently. They create high-frequency, localized chaos between them, which increases structural tension on the lattice.
Meaning they mechanically push each other apart. Yes. We label that repulsion. It's not a magical charge. It's just the physical mechanics of spinning waves grinding against each other.
Which brings us to the nuclear forces. The strong nuclear force is what supposedly holds the nucleus of an atom together, right?
Yes, overcoming the electromagnetic repulsion of the protons. Physicists say it's the strongest force in the universe, but it only works at microscopically short ranges.
How does the NKE handle that?
The NKE simplifies this elegantly. The strong nuclear force isn't a force at all. It is not a glue holding parts together.
Then what is it?
It is simply a measurement of thermodynamic and structural stability.
A measurement.
Yes. A proton is one of the most perfectly balanced, harmonious resonance cocktails that Falting's theorem allows to exist. It is a masterwork of structural geometry on the lattice.
So it's incredibly tough to break.
The strong force is nothing more than the massive amount of external kinetic energy you would have to apply to disrupt that perfect harmony and break the resonance. It is a threshold of destruction, not a binding agent.
And the weak nuclear force, the one that causes radioactive decay.
The weak force is simply the timeline of instability.
How so?
While Falting's theorem allows for a few perfectly stable structures, many complex resonances are only marginally stable. Over time, the continuous background static, the pink noise of the lattice chips, away at these imperfect structures.
Like erosion.
Exactly. Eventually, they lose their harmony and collapse into simpler, more stable frequencies. The weak force is just the probabilistic measurement of when a complex knot will spontaneously untie itself.
So we've essentially discarded the four fundamental forces of classical physics.
Pretty much.
Gravity is structural drag. Electromagnetism is spin interference. The strong force is a stability threshold. And the weak force is the probability of decay. It's incredibly unified. Everything is just emergent behavior of vibrations on an expanding web.
It strips away all the mystical, invisible forces and replaces them with pure geometric mechanics.
We have spent a lot of time in the subatomic basement looking at the lattice and the vibrations. I want to see how this architecture builds a universe.
Let's zoom out.
Yeah. How do we get from microscopic drag to the formation of galaxies and the planet we are sitting on? The original sources lay out a very specific chronological hierarchy, fundamentally redefining cosmological evolution.
They do. The NKE traces the journey of these resonances through a sequence of three distinct evolutionary phases, categorized as the three bangs.
Three bangs, but the classical model just has one.
Right. The classical Big Bang model posits that all matter and energy sprang into existence from a single point simultaneously. The NKE argues for a much slower, localized, and sequential buildup.
Let's start at phase one. We have the expanding busfill lattice, we have the symmetry breaks churning out orphan resonances, but we don't have atoms yet, we just have static.
Right. We enter the era of accumulation. For an unfathomable span of time, the author estimates roughly 100 billion years. The busfill process runs continuously, churning out static. Everywhere, in every corner of the expanding lattice, microscopic orphan resonances are left behind. These are incredibly weak vibrations, far too simple to form matter.
But they still have structure, which means they still create drag.
Exactly. Even a whisper of a resonance creates an infinitesimally small amount of drag against the expanding lattice. Over 100 billion years, this localized drag causes these incredibly weak, invisible resonances to slowly, agonizingly slowly, aggregate.
They clump together.
They form vast, structurally dense but non-material clouds across the universe.
Dense clouds of invisible structure. Wait, are you describing dark matter?
Yes, that is the NKE's elegant solution to the dark matter problem.
That's fascinating. Mainstream astrophysics observes that galaxies spin far too fast to be held together by the gravity of their visible matter.
And they theorize that there must be an invisible dark matter making up 85% of the mass of the universe, but they cannot find the particle.
The NKE says you can't find the particle because there is no particle.
Dark matter is simply the accumulated reservoir of 100 billion years of pure chaotic static. It is the raw material of the universe, slowly gathering tension.
That is brilliant. It's like the pregame buildup. Okay, so we have these colossal invisible clouds of accumulated static dragging the lattice. At some point, the tension has to break.
And that break is the Big Bang. Eventually, in localized regions of the universe, the density of this dark matter cloud reaches a critical threshold.
The drag becomes too much.
The structural drag becomes so immense that it overcomes the local expansion of the lattice. The region undergoes a catastrophic geometric collapse, folding in on itself, followed by a massive outward kinetic explosion.
So the Big Bang wasn't the origin of the whole universe, and it wasn't a singularity. It was just a localized collapse of a massive dark matter cloud.
Correct. And this collapse acts as an unimaginably intense thermodynamic pressure cooker. The extreme kinetic pressure forces the chaotic, weak resonances of the dark matter to violently fuse.
It forces them to find those stable geometric solutions dictated by Falting's theorem.
Yes, this extreme pressure bakes the static into the very first, lightest stable resonance cocktails, hydrogen and helium.
The static becomes the first real matter. The first stable chords are struck.
But a Big Bang only has enough pressure to forge the lightest elements. A universe of just hydrogen gas doesn't yield rocky planets or biological life.
We need carbon, silicon, iron.
Which brings us to the second bang, the mid-bang.
Okay, how does a mid-bang happen?
Once you have vast nebulae of hydrogen and helium, the drag effect continues to operate. The gas aggregates into massive, dense spheres. The structural friction ignites the first stars.
And stars are basically giant fusion engines.
Over billions of years, the immense gravitational drag of a supermassive star eventually causes it to collapse under its own structural weight.
A supernova.
Mainstream science calls it a supernova. The NKE categorizes it as a mid-bang. The collapse of a star creates a localized pressure cooker far more intense than the initial Big Bang.
So the pressure is exponentially higher.
The kinetic forces are so extreme that they violently smash the hydrogen and helium resonances together, forcing them to lock into far more complex, heavier resonance cocktails.
This is the forge for the rest of the periodic table.
The carbon in your DNA, the calcium in your bones, the gold in a ring, they're all complex resonances forged in the crushing pressure of a mid-bang.
The star dies, explodes, and scatters this heavy dust, these complex resonance cocktails across the lattice.
And then the drag effect pulls this heavy dust together into a spinning accretion disk.
A new, smaller star ignites in the center, and the leftover heavy material clumps together into planets. We now have a solid, rocky Earth floating in space.
But we aren't done.
Right, because you said there were 3 bangs. The Big Bang makes the gas, the mid-bang makes the rock. What does the third bang do?
The third phase is a radical reimagining of planetary evolution known as the Small Bang Theory, or SBT. It provides a mechanism for how an inert ball of rock transforms into a dynamic, structured system with moons, tectonic plates, and atmospheres.
Let's look at the traditional model first. The textbook standard for the creation of our moon is the giant impact hypothesis,
Which states that the early Earth was a molten ball, and a Mars-sized rogue planet called Theia happened to randomly smash into it.
The collision blasted a massive chunk of the Earth into orbit, which coalesced into the moon.
The author of the NKE heavily criticizes this model. An external, random, glancing collision of that magnitude is a chaotic event.
Chaotic collisions generally result in debris scattering, right?
Not the highly structured, perfectly cyclical, tidally locked relationship we see with our moon. The SBT argues that the Earth and the Moon are not the result of a random space accident, but the predictable result of an internal, endogenic thermodynamic process.
An internal process. Walk me through the chemistry and physics of an early planet according to the small bang theory.
Imagine the primordial Earth. It is a massive sphere of newly aggregated complex resonances, heavy metals, silicates, and trapped gases. As the exterior of this sphere is exposed to the absolute cold of space, it cools rapidly.
It forms a crust.
A thick, incredibly dense, rigid crust, primarily composed of granite.
A solid rock shell.
But beneath that shell, the interior is a churning, hyper-pressurized inferno of magma. More importantly, it is rich in highly volatile reactive gases: hydrogen, nitrogen, carbon, oxygen.
Because the granite crust has sealed the planet, these gases have nowhere to vent.
The Earth becomes a planetary-scale pressure cooker.
The thermodynamic energy inside is constantly increasing as radioactive decay and internal friction generate heat. But the volume is locked by the crust. The pressure has to be rising exponentially.
Over hundreds of millions of years, the internal pressure builds to an unimaginable degree. The volatile gases undergo extreme kinetic reactions.
The structural tension between the expanding interior and the rigid granite shell becomes the dominant geological force.
Sooner or later, the tensile strength of the granite is going to fail.
And the theory suggests that approximately 66 million years ago, the internal pressure finally exceeded the structural integrity of the Earth's crust.
The failure likely initiated near the equator, where the planet's rotational centrifugal forces added maximum stress. The crust ruptured.
A catastrophic failure of the shell.
This rupture triggered an instantaneous, violent decompression event, a massive endogenic explosion, a small bang.
The sudden release of billions of years of pent-up kinetic energy.
It didn't just vent gases, it literally blasted colossal, continent-sized chunks of the Earth's granite crust and upper mantle directly into the vacuum of space.
The Earth blew its own crust off.
Yes, and over the subsequent millennia, that massive cloud of ejected granite and nanomaterial, locked in Earth's gravitational drag, slowly aggregated and compressed to form the Moon.
Which elegantly explains why the isotopic composition of moon rocks is nearly identical to Earth's mantle.
It was born directly from it, not from a rogue alien planet.
That is a staggering visual. But the timeline, 66 million years ago, that is exactly the boundary of the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction event, the death of the dinosaurs.
Yes, it is.
The traditional taw is that a massive asteroid hit the Yucatan Peninsula, creating the Chicxulub crater, and the resulting dust cloud choked the planet.
The SBT posits that the mass extinction was not an exogenous event, not a rock falling from the sky, but an endogenous one. The Earth exploded from within.
Wow.
The small bang rupture would have instantly vaporized oceans, vented toxic deep Earth gases globally, and rained millions of tons of superheated debris back down upon the surface, causing global firestorms. The devastation would be near total.
It recontextualizes everything, but it doesn't just destroy, it shapes. The Earth popping its crust off wouldn't just be a localized hole.
The explosive decompression shattered the remaining crust. The SBT argues that this event is the origin point of our tectonic plates.
Because before the small bang, the Earth was a solid, continuous shell.
Exactly. The explosion cracked the shell into massive fragments, which we now call tectonic plates, and the release of volume allowed them to begin shifting.
Creating the dynamic continental drift geology we experience today.
So an internal pressure cooker creates the moon, wipes out the dinosaurs, cracks the crust to create tectonic plates, and fundamentally alters the atmosphere. It's a localized planetary rebirth.
And crucially, the NKE suggests this isn't a freak occurrence unique to Earth, right?
Right. It is a predictable evolutionary stage for rocky planets of a certain mass. A small bang is a natural mechanism for a universe seeking complex stability.
It sets the stage for life.
The venting of internal gases restructures atmospheres, the tectonic shifts create diverse geological environments, and the presence of a massive moon stabilizes the planet's axial tilt, regulating seasons.
The small bang creates the precise environmental stability required for advanced, complex biological resonance cocktails like us to thrive.
It is genuinely breathtaking to step back and view the unbroken continuity of this framework.
We started with the absolute canvas, a virtual microscopic split in an absolute void glitch in an infinitely fast algorithm.
That tiny symmetry break left behind a whisper of static.
Over 100 billion years, the drag of that static accumulated into vast clouds of dark matter. The sheer weight of those clouds collapsed the geometry of space in a big bang, forging light gases.
Those gases collapsed into stars, dying in mid-bangs to forge the heavy iron and carbon.
That heavy dust dragged together to form a sealed pressure cooker of a planet, which built up so much kinetic energy it blew its own crust off in a small bang, creating the moon.
It is a profoundly unified ontological theory. It provides the mechanism for the asphalt under the map, explaining the physical reality of every stage without resorting to unexplained pre-existing miracles.
I think it is important to reiterate to you, the learner, as we reach the end of this journey, that exploring the NKE does not require us to burn our physics textbooks. Einstein's equations regarding the relativity of moving bodies still work.
The chemical equations governing cellular biology still work.
The map of classical and quantum physics is still incredibly useful for navigating the universe. The NKE simply asks us to recognize that the map is printed on a canvas of structured nothingness.
We aren't demanding you accept this as unassailable dogma. It is a theoretical framework, a lens. But it is a lens that forces you to rigorously examine the assumptions of modern science.
And if we do look through that lens, it leads to one final, deeply provocative philosophical implication, We've talked about rocks and stars and atoms as complex resonance cocktails. But classical philosophy often separates the physical world from the mind.
Dualism suggests consciousness is a separate mystical layer.
The NKE leaves no room for dualism. There is no separate magical substance for thought.
Your brain, your neurons, the electrical impulses firing as you process this sentence, they're all strictly physical interactions.
You are a phenomenally complex, self-stabilizing biological resonance cocktail, vibrating on the exact same expanding busful lattice as a chunk of granite or a cloud of interstellar hydrogen.
We are quite literally made of the exact same static.
You are a temporary, localized vibration of nothingness, but consider the gravity of that.
Consider the sheer structural perfection required.
Through billions of years of symmetry breaks, microscopic drag, faultings, acoustic filtering, and catastrophic cosmic explosions, the static figured out a way to organize itself so perfectly with such exquisite geometric harmony that it developed the capacity to look back at the void, build a microphone, and study its own origins.
The nothingness woke up and started asking questions.
I cannot think of a more beautiful or humbling thought to leave on. Thank you so much for exploring this incredibly dense framework with me.
It was a pleasure.
And to you, the learner listening, keep questioning the reality around you. Keep looking at the walls, keep questioning the canvas beneath the paint, and remember that even in the absolute void, there is the potential for an infinite symphony. We'll see you next time.